Hello and welcome to the dumbest idea for a GameSack episode. The dumbest idea yet. I figured I'd make a guide for all games compatible with the Sega 3D control pad in its analog mode. That's right, it's called the 3D control pad. Look at that. All three dimensions represented right there. But many games that were designed for the arcade racer and the mission stick also just happen to work with this, so I figured I'd extend the coverage in this episode to those games as well. Anyway, hopefully you find this episode helpful and most of all, entertaining. So, let's get started. We begin with the Advanced World War, The Last of the Millennium from Sega. This is a strategy game that stayed in Japan. You play as the Germans and move your military stuff around to try to win battles. The 3D control pad certainly works here, but as most of the game is menu driven, there's no real advantage in using it. This is Andretti Racing from Electronic Arts. You guessed it, this is a racing game. It has a ton of tracks and different modes to play, but other than that, I found it a bit underwhelming. The only analog controls that work with this one is the Sega Arcade Racer steering wheel. You can't use the 3D control pad. While it is underwhelming, you could do worse than this game. This is Baroque from Sting and ESP, released only in Japan. This is a cool first-person roguelike game where you wander around collecting weapons, items, and other things. It has a creepy vibe, which I like. The 3D control pad works pretty well here, though it could be a bit smoother. The analog triggers work great for strafing though, and let you adjust the speed on the fly as you do it. Apparently there's an English patch for this one, and I should definitely try that at some point. Here's Battle Garega from Rising and Electronic Arts, another Japan-only title on the console. This excellent vertical shooter allows you to control the plane with the 3D control pad. Yeah, even though the game itself is in 2D. Marketing always gives things fun names. Anyway, this not only allows your plane to move in more than the standard 8 directions you get with a regular D-pad, but you also have very precise control over the speed of movement as well. This can make dodging some things a bit easier. This is Black Dawn from Virgin. This is a port of the PlayStation game. You can't use the 3D control pad in analog mode in this one. If you try, none of the buttons work. It does work with the mission stick though. Even then, the controls are pretty convoluted even when set up in arcade mode. Oh well, now you know that this one exists, so let's move on. A slightly better game is Black Fire from Sega Away Team. I always mix the title up with Black Dawn. It's better control-wise anyway, again only slightly. This is another game meant for the mission stick, but it's actually forwards compatible with the 3D control pad. In fact, I prefer playing it that way because the L and R shoulder buttons are less awkward compared to the mission stick, and that's how you adjust your altitude here. It is a pretty ugly game though.
Evade! Evade!
Here's Burning Rangers from Sega. This was a very hyped release from Sega where you play as future firefighters rescuing people from burning buildings and the such. The 3D pad works okay here. You can steer your character a bit better compared to the 8 directions of the D-pad, but you can't control the speed you run at. It is better with the analog controller, but not hugely so.
Read. Speed machine has been destroyed. I've secured this area. Rangers, use extreme caution.
This is Can Can Bunny Premiere 2 from Kid. This is a dating sim where the 3D control pad moves the cursor around. The next year they released Can Can Bunny Extra. These of course were only released in Japan. This is more of the same thing. Pretty exciting. Here's Koro Q Park from Takara, released only in Japan. In this one there's a park you need to work around. You can eventually drive various penny racers around. The 3D control pad works a bit better than the regular D-pad, but there's so much slowdown here that keeps ramping up and down that it becomes very hard to appreciate no matter how you play it. This is Code R from Quintet and ESP. What the hell are you gonna make? Well, this is a racing game where you try to get the best time climbing and descending hills. There's also a story mode which features lots of text and personal race battles. The 3D control pad works well enough for the races, but don't throw the switch over to the digital mode or the controller will stop working completely. You'll have to unplug and replug it to get it working again. Here's Congo, the Lost City of Zinj from Sega Away Team and Jumping Jack Software. This is a rather dreadful first-person shooter. The mission stick is supported, but it doesn't give you analog control in any way, and it behaves exactly like a normal controller. So the only advantage that you gain is if you prefer the form factor of the mission stick. And who doesn't? The 3D control pad won't work here in analog mode. This is Crime Wave from Eidos. This is a very disorienting driving game where you hunt down criminals and destroy them. It's compatible with the Sega Arcade Racer. If you try to use a 3D control pad and turn on analog mode, the game will pause and there's nothing you can do. The Japanese version also supports the mission stick, and it's not good. The trigger doesn't even fire your guns. You can remap the controls though if you want. Here's Croc, Legend of the Gobos from Argonaut. This is a 3D platformer which came out around the same time as Super Mario 64, September of '97. And if you didn't know, this title started its life as a Yoshi game using the Super FX chip on the Super NES. But then, Nintendo told Argonaut to F off and please go away forever. They kept working on it and it came out for the next generation hardware and, well, here we are. The analog controls work better than the digital controls, but there's plenty of other ways that this game will fight you. It was, however, the infancy of 3D platformers, so this should surprise no one. This is Crypt Killer from Konami. This one has some flashing screens. This is a light gun game in which you must shoot and kill crypts. Not crypts, this isn't a gang war. The 3D control pad will control your on-screen reticle. I'm not sure why the screen still flashes even though I'm not using a light gun. This is by far the worst looking version of the game, but it has good audio.
Gatling gun. Be careful.
Here's Cyber Speedway from Sega, released close to the US launch in 1995. This death sled racing game precedes the Wipeout series. This was built for the Arcade Racer, but it also works fine with the 3D control pad. And after a few seconds of wobbling around, it feels pretty natural, better than the digital controls. The North American version changed the music as Sega of America liked to do. It's credited to Bygone Dogs, but that's just basically Spencer Nilsson and crew. The Japanese version, known as Grand Chaser, still has good music as well. There are more than a few games that use the 3D control pad that really didn't benefit in any way, like these next two. This is Dyson Ryaku Strong Style from System Soft. It seems to be a very complex strategy game which I can't figure out. But the 3D control pad works in the menus. I was unable to escape the menu, so I can't tell you much more about this one. This is Daisuke from Gaga Communications. It's a dating sim with lots of text. The 3D control pad works exactly like the digital controller here, so there's seemingly no advantage. Here's Dark Savior from Sega and Climax. This cool sequel to Landstalker on the Genesis retains the isometric perspective. If you hold the L shoulder button, you can look around your environment a bit. The 3D control pad only provides a shortcut for this function. You still walk around with the D-pad, but now you just have to move your thumb up to the analog stick to look around. It's definitely more convenient, but hardly groundbreaking. This is a good game, and if you're gonna play it, you might as well use an analog controller. This is Darklight Conflict from Rage Software and EA. This is a very British space combat game. The 3D control pad works decently here. It feels a little more natural with the mission stick, but still not outstanding. Here's Daytona USA from Sega, released at launch in North America. This one's meant to use either digital controls or the Arcade Racer. You can even use the 3D control pad, but it's very sensitive and you'll likely oversteer and crash often. You'll also have to very carefully finesse the analog stick if you want to pick the intermediate track. So while it works, I recommend the controls that it was designed for instead. Here's Daytona USA Championship Circuit Edition from Sega, released a year and a half later. This one basically tries to make up for the poor quality of the original release. 2 extra tracks were added as well as more cars. Unfortunately, we lost the cheesy music. This one was built with the 3D control pad in mind, though it also works with the arcade racer. The control here using the 3D control pad is much better, though it can still be a bit twitchy depending on which car you choose. Also, now you get analog gas and brake, which can help out a lot. I still like the original release better, at least when playing it with the digital controls. This is Daytona USA Circuit Edition from Sega, released the next year. This is the Japanese version of Championship Circuit Edition, except that it spent more time in the oven and is overall more of a complete game. The draw distance is a little better, you can choose your time of day, and they even let you choose the original music. Granted, it's the arcade music, not the excellent arrangements from the first Saturn port. Oh well, close enough, I'll take it. The control feels slightly better as well. Here's Deep Fear from Sega. This cool Resident Evil ripoff was sadly never released in North America. When playing with the D-pad, you have tank controls, which means pressing up moves you forward no matter what. With the 3D control pad, you walk in the direction that you press. This might sound cool and all, but it's super easy to get confused when the angles switch as you enter another part of the scene. I'd rather play this one with the digital tank controls for that reason. Destruction Derby from Psygnosis is another one that never came to North America. This one's designed to use the arcade racer, but the 3D control pad works perfectly fine here as well. It looks pretty bad compared to the PlayStation version, but at least here you got some smooth analog controls that don't require you to twist a controller, I guess. Here's Die Hard Trilogy from Probe, one of 2 Die Hard games on the Saturn. It's the only one to use the 3D control pad, and only for the third movie portion of the game. Die Hard 1 doesn't let you use it. You'd think that Die Hard 2, which is a crosshair shooter, would use it, but no. The third title has you driving around, and it does help make minute adjustments in your steering. This is Drift King Shutoko Battle 97 from Genki. Here's a racing game that features smooth analog control. Unfortunately, the controls don't default to having your gas and brake on the triggers. You can assign them that way if you want though. But if you do that, they act as regular buttons. There's no analog action for your gas and brakes. Still though, the steering action is quite nice in this one. Here's Duke Nukem 3D from Lobotomy. This is a rude and crude first-person shooter with fantastic controls. The trigger buttons allow for variable speed strafing. The analog stick is as smooth as silk. I wouldn't recommend playing this with any other controller. Make no mistake though, I still suck at this game big time. I always have. This one's called Enemy Zero, and it's from Warp. It's mainly a spooky full-motion video game with stitched-together FMV sequences set aboard a spaceship. Using the 3D control pad here makes no difference at all compared to the digital input. However, the game also has some 3D polygonal segments, and the analog control helps make those feel a little smoother. This is F1 Challenge by Sega. As you've guessed, this is another racing game. It's made for the arcade racer, but the 3D control pad can also work decently. It feels slightly better than using the D-pad. This one's called Fantastep and is from Jalico. This is a Japan-only point-and-click adventure game. The 3D control pad moves your cursor as well as your dude when you're walking him around. This one looks like it could be interesting if I had any idea what was going on. It's Fusui Sensei from Hakuhodo. This is another Japan-only game. It appears to be a feng shui simulation of sorts. I'm not sure what's going on here, but the 3D control pad works exactly as the regular D-pad does. Here's G-Vector from Soft Orifice Office. This is a forward-scrolling shooter that evokes memories of Panzer Dragoon, and it was only released in Japan. It doesn't do those memories justice though, as it's very difficult, and you need to replay the entire stage if you die. The 3D control pad doesn't seem to offer much advantage to the digital controls. This is Gale Racer from Sega, an early game for the console in Japan. This is basically a half-assed port of the arcade game called Radmobile. That was Sega's first 32-bit game ever, and also the first time Sonic the Hedgehog appeared anywhere. That's right, Sonic appeared first in 32-bit. This one's made for the arcade racer, but the 3D control pad works perfectly. This is my first time playing the game with analog controls, and I did way better than I ever have before, so it must make a difference. This game won't appeal to most people, but I get a kick out of it. This is Gen War from Sega Away Team and Jumping Jack Software. You control a mech in this space combat simulator. It works with a mission stick, but there's really no analog nuance in your movements at all. It puts you more in the action than a regular controller, I guess. The 3D control pad doesn't work with this game. Here's GT24 from Jaleco, released in Japan only. This is a modified port of Jaleco's arcade game called Super GT 24 Hours. The analog control works pretty well in this average racing game. You have analog gas and brake triggers. Here's Hang On GP from Sega. This mediocre motorcycle racing game was made with the arcade racer in mind, but the 3D control pad also works. However, you might find that the control is comically bad when using it. I mean, just look at this. It's incredibly sensitive. But I found that if I just held the analog stick up while moving it around left and right along the top semicircle of the thing, it controls really well. Much better than I was ever able to with a regular controller. Hardcore 4x4 from Gremlin. This awful off-road racing game can use the 3D control pad. It doesn't help you have any fun though. Here's High Velocity from Atlas and Cave. I always like this little racing game. You can use the arcade racer for analog control, however you can't use the 3D control pad. Hell, I even like this one with the regular D-pad. This is Highway 2000 from Genki and Natsume. This is a decent racing game that can also be played with the arcade racer. And like High Velocity, you can't use the 3D control pad, so you can go straight to hell. Ah yes, it's The House of the Dead from Sega. I think I appreciate the Saturn version of this light gun shooter more and more each time I play it. At first I didn't like it because I was so used to the sequel on the Dreamcast, but really, for a Saturn game, this isn't bad. Oh, and the 3D control pad can move your cursor around the screen if you choose to play it without a light gun. It doesn't play half bad this way.
Help! That voice.
It was vital for any racing game made after the introduction of the 3D control pad to support it. Yeah, that's all I popped on here to say. Here's Initial D, Kadoka, from Genki. You race up and down hills on this one. There's also a story attached to it. The controls seem a little squirrely at first, but you do have full analog throttle and braking. Otherwise, it seems like the other Initial D games that I've played, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's J-League Go 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 from Tecmo, released only in Japan. This soccer game lets you use the analog controller to move your players around. That's all fine, I guess. It's just tough for me to get a controllable guy close to the ball so I can affect gameplay. What else can I say? It's a soccer game. This is Jungle Park Saturn Jima from BMG. This Japan-only title seems to be a point-and-click adventure. I can't figure anything out even on the first screen here. There's very little you can do. The analog controller will move your cursor though. This is Kiss Yori from Kid, only released in Japan. This one lets you do something you can only do in a video game: read text. You can use the analog controller in menus and stuff, but you'll spend most of your time mindlessly tapping the A button to advance the copious amounts of text. This is Kuro no Dansho, the literary fragment from Oz Club, another one only released in Japan. This is a point-and-click adventure where, again, it seems impossible to get past the first screen. The analog controller moves the cursor, however you can slow it down or speed it up by pressing the left or right trigger. Kinda defeats the purpose of analog control, but hey, here we are. Here's The Lost World Jurassic Park from Appaloosa. This one lets you use the 3D control pad, but there's really no advantage to it at all. You're either moving or you're not. This one isn't very exciting no matter what controller or console you choose. This is Manx TT Superbike from Sega. You get analog steering, throttle, and braking in this motorcycle racing game, but I find that it's still extremely sensitive, requiring me to tap it in a direction. I'm not sure why this game exists. There's very little content here.
Passing the checkpoint.
It's Mech Warrior 2 from Activision. This one's designed for the mission stick, and it works great that way, but the 3D control pad also works. In fact, you get fully forward and reverse throttles with the triggers. The only thing that might be a deal breaker is that down is up and up is down. That's fine with the mission stick, but a bit difficult to get used to in a game like this using the analog controller.
Enemy detected.
Midway presents Arcade's Greatest Hits. This has 6 classic arcade games to choose from. They all work with the mission stick. Some, like Missile Command, Super Breakout, and Centipede, work very well with analog movements. Sadly, you can't use the 3D control pad in analog mode at all. Here's NASCAR 98 from Electronic Arts. This one supports the arcade racer, but the 3D control pad will also work, and it's mostly fine. This game could almost be okay if it weren't for the hillbilly music. Here's The Need for Speed from Electronic Arts. This is a great game that added a lot from the 3DO original. It really holds its own against the PlayStation version as well. In fact, the textures are less warpy. This one was meant for the arcade racer. Sadly, you can't use the 3D control pad, and if you try, you'll get this. However, the Japanese version called Nissan Presents Overdriven GTR, which came out a bit later, does support the 3D control pad. You have analog steering as well as analog gas and brake. The steering is stiff, but that's just how the game is. This one is awesome. The only bad thing about it is you can only choose Nissan cars. This is Night Striker S from Taito and Ving. This chaotic forward-scrolling shooter is sometimes pretty tough to figure out what's happening on screen. It's still pretty easy though, as you get tons of continues. Both the 3D control pad and the mission stick are officially supported, but I think it plays slightly better with the mission stick. And here's Nights into Dreams from Sega. This was the first official game to use the analog controller, and my copy of the game came with the controller. Or maybe the controller came with the game? This was Sega's answer to the Nintendo 64 and Super Mario 64. You basically fly a jester around in a dreamland, collect blue things, and put them into pods. Once the pod has enough blue things, it blows up. You need to blow up 4 of them in each stage. In addition, there's some kind of pet simulator going on beneath everything called A-Life that I never understood, much less got into. The game is enjoyable, and I don't recommend playing it without the 3D control pad, though you can if you hate yourself. I really like the music in this one too. Later, that very same year, Sega released Christmas Nights. This was a free promotional game, unless you lived in Japan where you had to pay for it. It contains a Christmas level for each character, and it does different things depending on how the clock in your Saturn is set. The gameplay is identical to the original game, just holiday themed. This was a fantastic gift from Sega. This is Oedo Renaissance from Bits. This is a simulation game where you can manage a city during the Edo period in Japan. The analog controller seems to work more for convenience than any actual control advantage. It's Panzer Dragoon from Sega, a launch game for the console in 1995. This excellent game was designed to use the mission stick, and it works great, but the 3D control pad also works, and it works surprisingly well. In fact, you'd never know that it didn't have native support for the controller. No matter what you use to play this one, you're gonna have a good time. The next year, Sega gave us Panzer Dragoon 2 Zwei, which is a redundant title. This one officially adds support for the 3D control pad, and its implementation here is exactly like the first game, which goes to show you just how well it worked there. I can't recommend this game enough, and an analog controller, mission stick, or even the shuttle mouse makes it even better. Two years later, we got Panzer Dragoon Saga. This one, as most of you know, is more of an RPG, and it has official support for the analog pad. It works mostly the same as it did in the previous two games when you're on the Dragon. You can also control your dude on foot as well. Overall, it doesn't make a huge difference in the gameplay, but it does make it more comfortable. This is Pia Carrot from Kid. This is an anime dating simulator where the analog controller moves the cursor. Surprisingly, the sequel which followed doesn't use the analog controller. Here's Planet Joker from Nagsat, only released in Japan. You get analog controls of your ship in this ugly shooter. I might cover this one more in depth in a Games That Make the Console Look Weak episode sometime in the future, as this does the Saturn no favors. Here's Power Slave from Lobotomy. This innovative first-person shooter features some of the smoothest analog controls ever. You've also got silky smooth analog strafing. This one's basically a first-person Metroidvania of sorts. It's a treat to play, and I couldn't even imagine playing this one with digital controls. Lobotomy also made Quake on the Saturn. Once again, the analog controls are super smooth here. Those guys at Lobotomy were insanely good at what they did. Interestingly, they had some former Nintendo of America employees. Give this one a go, and if you do, you must use the 3D control pad. I mean, you don't have to, but you should. That's right, I'm holding this in every single camera segment just because. Anyway, I'm glad that Sega was able to add a whole bunch of different control options for their various arcade ports that they ported to the Saturn. Check it out. Many of the Sega Aegis ports feature analog controls. Afterburner 2, Space Harrier, and Galaxy Force 2 all support the mission stick, and they work amazingly well. Outrun as well as Power Drift support the Sega Arcade Racer. But all 5 of these games also officially support the 3D control pad. I'd personally rather use the mission stick for Space Harrier and Afterburner, mainly because it makes them more like the arcade. But everything still works quite well with the 3D control pad. In fact, with Outrun and Power Drift, you get analog throttle and braking, which you can't do with the Arcade Racer. This applies to the North American Sega Aegis release from Working Designs as well. Here's Sega Rally Championship from, well, Sega. First off, this is my favorite racing game on the console, bar none. It's designed for the Arcade Racer. But the 3D control pad works fine if you try it, allowing for a bit more precision than using a digital controller. In late 1996, Japan got Sega Rally Championship Plus. This one added X-band support for online play. It also has slightly longer draw distance, though it's very tough to notice. It also added official support for the 3D control pad. That means we now have full analog gas and brakes. The next year, North America got Sega Rally Championship Plus Netlink Edition. This is basically the Plus version, but with Netlink online support instead of X-band. Everything else is basically the same.
Easy left. Easy left, baby.
Sega Touring Car Championship also came from Sega, if you can believe it. This is a rather sloppy racing game, but there's still a small amount of fun to be had here. The 3D control pad does its best, but there's not much you can do to fight the momentum in this super fast game. I was always disappointed in the warpy road graphics in this one. It's Shining Force 3 from Sega. This is an excellent strategy RPG. All 3 scenarios support the 3D control pad for smoother walking in all directions and speeds. You also get more control of spinning the camera with the analog triggers. It's not really advantageous to the gameplay at all, but at least they supported it. Shockwave Assault is a game from Electronic Arts. This port of the 3DO game and its expansion is designed to work with the mission stick, and it works very well too. You can control everything with just one hand as the little thumb wheel controls your throttle. It's one of the few games to use that little thumb wheel on the mission stick. That leaves your other hand free to do other things. Unfortunately, the 3D control pad won't work here.
The Egyptians are on our side.
Sky Target from Sega. This port of the Model 2 arcade game is basically a poor man's Afterburner. Despite how it looks and sounds, you can still have a bit of fun with it. You can use either the 3D control pad or the mission stick, but the mission stick makes it a hair more exciting since you're controlling a plane and all. Sonic 3D Blast from Traveler's Tales. You'd think analog controls would help out in this isometric game, but I kinda had more trouble with them. Not that I do very well with the digital controls. There doesn't seem to be any analog advantages. The game just seems to let you use the pad if you want. It's Sonic Jam from Sega. This is a collection of the main Sonic games from the Genesis. Honestly, this is a lot worse than I remember. It has tons of slowdown. You can use the 3D control pad if you like, but you won't get any analog advantages. However, in the 3D Sonic World portion of the game, you do get analog speed control. The triggers move the camera, but not with any analog precision. This is the infamous Sonic R from Traveler's Tales. This game doesn't control well no matter what you use. But I will say that I feel a digital controller is slightly less annoying than the 3D control pad. With the 3D control pad, you have so much oversteer it's not even funny. It has great graphics and catchy music though. Tokyo Guruntai is a shooter from Rising and Electronic Arts. This is a really cool and definitely tough game that was only released in Japan. The fully analog controls help you control your ship more precisely, and you'll need all the help you can get in this one. Still, you'll always want to try again and again, even when you run out of continues, because it's just so fun. This is Soviet Strike from Electronic Arts. Oh boy, this one's kind of rough, isn't it? The 3D control pad does provide for a slightly smoother feeling experience, and every little bit helps in this incredibly choppy game. This is Starfighter from Chrysalis. This one's meant for the mission stick, and you can't use the 3D control pad. The digital controls are better than the mission stick, but I can't find any way to make this one enjoyable to control at all. I know this one has its fans, but I'm not one of them. Here's Taito Chase HQ plus SCI. This Japan-only title is a bundle of the arcade games of the same names. This is made to take advantage of the arcade racer, but if you feel daring, you can use the 3D control pad. The steering is a tad twitchy, so I recommend holding up at all times and just moving it around the top semicircle to be more precise. You also need to shift by tapping the D-pad. The way the buttons happen to be laid out while using the 3D control pad make using either an arcade racer or the normal digital controls preferable. Thunder Force 5 from Technosoft is a fantastic shooter that was only released in Japan. This one introduces a lot of polygons to the franchise, for better or for worse. You also get fully analog control of your ship if you want. It's nice, but the game moves so quickly that you rarely have time to appreciate such precision. This one's worth playing no matter what if you enjoy shooters. Here's Thunderstrike 2 from Core Design, also known as Thunderhawk 2. This military helicopter action game is a follow-up to the Sega CD original. It was designed with the mission stick in mind, and it controls quite well with it. I like that the thumb wheel effortlessly controls your altitude. Unfortunately, the 3D control pad won't work here at all. This is Togue, King of Spirits 2 from Atlas and Cave. This racing game is actually High Velocity 2, but this one stayed in Japan. The goal here is to get as much Togue as you can. It supports analog controls with the 3D control pad, and you get analog gas and brakes as well. Here's Vadalva from Ancient. You can use analog controls to move your vehicle around in this strange arena vehicle combat game. This one was only released in Japan. Here's Virtua Cop 2 from Sega. Like the House of the Dead, this light gun game can also be played with the 3D control pad. Unfortunately, this one doesn't play quite as well with it. It's extremely twitchy. Even after I dialed down the gun looseness, as they call it, it was still tough to not need to continue once every few seconds. Also, the title screen does not support an analog controller, so you need to switch it to digital to even begin the game. Just use a light gun instead. Virtua Call S is another dating sim from Kid. You can move the cursor around with the analog pad in this Japan-only game. It's Virtua Racing from Time Warner Interactive. The Saturn version here supports the arcade racer if you'd like to use some analog control. Unfortunately, the 3D control pad's analog stick is completely ignored if you try to use it. This is Virtual Kyoto from Nichibutsu. This seems to be some sort of a boat racing game that was only released in Japan. I'm not sure exactly what it wants me to do, but you can use the analog controller with it, though it doesn't seem to feel very smooth at all. Virtual Kyoto 2 came out later. This is basically more of the same. Maybe it's a little better? Wave Race 64 it isn't. Here's Wing Arms from Sega. This flight combat game has you piloting propeller-driven planes. It's designed for the mission stick, but it also works great with the 3D control pad. Heck, it almost feels like it was designed for it. Wipeout got a Saturn version from Psygnosis and Perfect Entertainment. This futuristic death sled racing game supports the arcade racer for its analog controls. Sadly, the 3D control pad won't work with it, but you can still use the D-pad even when the controller is switched to the analog mode. Wipeout 2097, also known as Wipeout XL, also got a Saturn port. This one was only released in Europe and Japan. This one officially supports the 3D control pad. However, I don't feel that the analog pad really makes any difference at all compared to using digital controls in this one. Unfortunately, the air brakes don't seem to make use of the analog technology in the triggers. Finally, we have World Cup 98 France Road to Win from Sega. This is basically a sequel to Worldwide Soccer 98, and this one was only released in Japan. It looks pretty much the same, and that's not a bad thing. It's a decently playing game, though I'm not sure the analog controls afford me much of an advantage here. But I will say that it is more comfortable to move my players around using the analog stick. Go! And there you go, every game that supports the 3D control pad, and a few that don't, but still have analog modes. Hopefully this episode wasn't as dumb as it sounded to me as I was in the middle of making it. And some of you more astute viewers might have noticed that Sega was heavily influenced by the 3D control pad when they designed the Dreamcast controller. I gotta be honest here, I like the Saturn pad 10-1 over the Dreamcast controller. Anyway, what do you think of the Sega 3D control pad? You let me know, and you let me know right now. In the meantime, thank you for watching GameSack. Did you know that the cord for the Sega 3D control pad detaches from the main unit? This allows you to use the controller with other systems, like the original TurboGrafx 16. Now you can enjoy fabulous Sega games like Afterburner 2, Outrun, Fantasy Zone, or holy crap, look, it's even Thunderblade! Are you getting excited yet? Don't be stuck playing boring Saturn games. Get the TurboGrafx 16 controller adapter today.